I have titled this talk, Pauli Murray, The Role of a Family in Shaping an Extraordinary Life. I haven't seen many of you since last year on International Women's Day, when I spoke about our National Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. So I'm especially happy to be with you. Today, I'm going to introduce you to another inspirational woman. Her name is Pauli Murray. She was born Anna Pauline Murray in 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland, to a middle-class Black family with roots in both the North and the South. She was the first African-American woman to earn a Doctor of Jurisprudence and also the first African-American woman to be ordained by the Episcopal Church. Because of a recent biography and a brand new film, she is just now becoming known for the kind of activism that made Rosa Parks famous and for the legal thought that underpinned both the civil rights movement and the women's movement. I'm going to tell the story of her life in a very abbreviated form in order to understand how she came by the courage to live as she did in the face of the many strikes against her. Anna Pauline's early childhood was tragic. Her mother died suddenly of a massive stroke when she was just 3, leaving behind 6 children and a husband who was debilitated already from a case of typhoid fever. Pauli was separated from the other children and sent to Durham, North Carolina, to live with her mother's sister, Pauline Fitzgerald, and her grandparents, Robert and Corinne Fitzgerald. I'm going to talk about her experiences within that family at length, but I'm sure that you can imagine what it was like outside the family in North Carolina between 1913 and 1926, at the height of the Jim Crow period in our national history. Her father was beaten to death in an asylum when she was 12. She attended an all-Black school that only went through grade 11. She could have attended only one Negro college, but she decided to leave North Carolina at 16 with the impossible dream of attending Columbia University, an all-male school. And she was able to stay in New York after she got there, only because a cousin was there and arranged for her to attend a huge white high school in Queens to prepare for admission, not to Columbia, but to Hunter College of the City University of New York. Having entered Hunter and having moved to Harlem on her own in 1928, she graduated from college in 5 years in 1933, one of the worst years of the Depression. For the next 5 years, she supported herself with odd jobs, waitressing, taking care of children, doing whatever, house cleaning, whatever was possible. And at that time, she became involved in the labor movement, meeting many of the most important Black thinkers and artists in Harlem. Early in this period, in 1930, she was briefly married, only to find that sex with a man was not for her, and that her desire to become a man was impossible. Throughout her life, from this point on, she had frequent breakdowns. She was helped by friendships with some extraordinary people, Thurgood Marshall, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt. But her life was never easy. In 1938, her application for graduate study in sociology at the University of North Carolina was refused because of her race. Luckily, Thurgood Marshall heard her speak on behalf of a sharecropper on death row and arranged for her to go to Howard University, an all-Black university in Washington, D.C., on a scholarship for a law degree. There, she was free of racial prejudice, but she was scorned as a woman, even though she was at the top of her class. When she applied to do further work in law at Harvard, as other top classmates were encouraged to do, she was refused on the basis of gender. She famously replied to that refusal that she would gladly change her gender, but didn't have the faintest idea how to do it. She eventually got a degree from the law school at Berkeley instead, and then was accepted at Yale for the JD degree, finishing in 1948 at 38 years old, 15 years and 3 advanced degrees after college, only to find that jobs in law for Black women were scarcer than hen's teeth. The Methodist Church stepped in at this point, asking her to study the various laws concerning segregation across the country. And this led to a lengthy volume that the NAACP used as its Bible, and that provided the facts for the famous case Brown versus the Board of Education that came before the Supreme Court. Exhausted from that effort in 1952, Murray took 4 years off from the law to write a family history, Proud Shoes, a book that I highly recommend because of its successful blend of compelling prose, fascinating oral history, and expert archival research in all sorts of documents, public and private. From 1956 to 1960, she worked for a prestigious New York law firm as one of only 3 women, and then accepted an offer from a law school in Ghana, returning in 1961 to be part of Kennedy's Committee on the Status of Women and to participate with Betty Friedan in the founding of NOW. In the 1960s and early 70s, she took on several cases of gender discrimination and held teaching positions at several universities. But in the mid-1970s, she turned away from the law to religion, attending Episcopal Seminary for her 4th advanced degree. She was ordained in 1977 at 67 years of age, 3 years before mandatory retirement. So she held only part-time jobs in the Episcopal Church. But she did get to administer communion at the small church in Chapel Hill, where her grandmother was baptized as a slave. She died in poverty in 1985, but was sainted by the church. It shouldn't surprise us to find that her final book was titled Song in a Weary Throat. It was as if she had lived several lives in her 75 years. Don't you wonder what led to such a strong desire for further education and to the willpower to break through so many ceilings? I do, and I found some answers, I think, in her family history, Proud Shoes, book about Robert Fitzgerald, her grandfather, a free Black from Pennsylvania, and Cornelia Smith, her grandmother, the daughter of a slave and a white slave owner from North Carolina. Robert's family had gained freedom from the Fitzgerald owners 2 generations before the Civil War and had prospered in Pennsylvania as farmers and brickmakers, buying land and building their own family compound. Robert loved books and sought higher education, which was not available even to free Blacks. So his family sponsored the development of an academy for Blacks, which later became Lincoln University. The school soon began to send its more talented pupils south to work with less fortunate Black youth. And Robert was sent to Durham, North Carolina, where he experienced the meaning of slavery firsthand. When North Carolina seceded from the Union, along with his fathers and his brothers, he joined the Union Army. He served in various capacities in both the Army and the Navy until he was nearly blinded, at which time he returned home to Pennsylvania. But he was soon drawn back to the mission of educating others in North Carolina, where he met the beautiful and intelligent Cornelia Smith and settled in Durham to raise a family of 5 daughters and a son, earning a meager living by teaching, tanning hides, making bricks, and other labors. Cornelia's family was altogether a different story. The head of the Smith family had been an officer in the Confederacy and a member of the legislature who owned 30 slaves in Chapel Hill before the war. His progeny, Mary, Simon, and Francis, were well educated. Mary had attended a female seminary, and the brothers had attended the University of North Carolina. Simon was a lawyer, and Francis was a doctor in his father's footsteps. Both of these men fell in love with Harriet, their African-American and Cherokee slave. And she had children by both of them, 3 girls and 1 boy. Although Harriet remained a slave until her death, her girls, Cornelia included, were raised as white since they resembled the Smiths and there were no other children. It was a complicated arrangement, to say the least, although they were baptized as servants and accompanied Mary as such everywhere she went. They had access to their father's libraries, to their aunt's conversations with friends, despite criticism from the local gentry. Mary gave them property in her will, although most of her wealth went to the university that would later deny access to her great grandniece. During the Reconstruction, Robert and Cornelia had bought an acre of land in a part of Durham that was open to Blacks. And in the years when Pauli lived there, 1913 to 1926, Cornelia patrolled it, complaining loudly about the behavior of her neighbors. She spoke highly of her father and sadly of her mother. She loved and respected her husband, but she expected to be treated as well as her white family had been treated before the Civil War. By the time Pauli arrived, Robert's blindness prevented him from classroom teaching, and he had long sought the pension that was due from the armed services with no success until very near the end of his life. So for both grandparents, the desire for social justice was present on a daily basis. And Pauli's three aunts, Pauline, Marie, and Sally, taught in the Black school and supported the family. Now, there were many tensions. It was not an obvious recipe for producing a brilliant woman who would break barriers in law and religion, not to mention gender, race, and sexuality. But it was a family with a proud history. A grandfather who had fought for the Union, participated in Reconstruction, and was widely respected as an educator. A grandmother who chose a Black husband instead of trying to pass as white, but was vocal about being equal to anyone. Aunts who refused to be daunted by their restriction to teaching in an all-Black school that only went to the 11th grade, and were pleased to be the breadwinners for their parents and for their sister's daughter. There was a lot of love in this family, a lot of storytelling, a lot of respect for each other. Each member of the family carried his or her own weight to the best of their ability, even in childhood or old age. Neither race nor gender had stopped any member of the family from doing what they thought was right. So thus, Pauli, as she renamed herself in college, when she had to take on menial jobs to support herself, did not see this as a dead end, but rather a step toward a better future. When she excelled in high school, college, law schools on both coasts or at Yale, she didn't worry about being different, although prejudice distressed her. She had always been different, and she had been respected accordingly. When her marriage proved disastrous, she did not think that she had failed, but that she had another path to discover. And when she was successful, she did not feel that she had to stop searching for something further. I think that her 13 years with a family that did not fit the stereotypes of white or Black families in either the North or the South gave her a sense that she was a person with the right to pursue her individual goals and talents. After all, her space of origin was both Black and white, and successfully so. Thus, why not think outside the box in other ways as well, even if no one in her social world granted her that freedom? As she said later in life, her family looked like the United Nations when they came together, with every human feature from blue eyes and blonde hair to dark skin and kinky hair. But they were all members of her family. In the introduction to her family history, finished when she was 46, Murray explains that in her journey through the documents that affirmed and completed the stories her relatives had told, she saw that her family had made her a lifelong fighter against all forms of inequality and injustice. And she saw this fight as her American heritage. The title, Proud Shoes, comes from a comment by Stephen Vincent Benet on a book of poems called American Song. And he said of the poet, "Here is somebody walking in America in proud shoes." The secret of her achievements, I think, lies in her embrace of that heritage, even when the conditions in America that surrounded her and her family were not favorable. I think that Murray and her family have a lot to teach us, even now, about how to solve pressing problems of race and gender. I think they need to be solved in our mixed families, our mixed heritage, our proud history that allows no legitimate space for ideas of racial purity or the idea of a single place for all women. As Henry Louis Gates often says in his PBS program, Finding Your Roots, it is a rare African American who has no white family members. And it may also be a rare so-called white American who has no heritage that was once understood as non-white. Think of the prejudice against Southern and Eastern Europeans, for example, or the so-called Black Irish in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Likewise, no matter where we turn now in social history, women's achievements outside the home are on display. There is no legitimate space for ideas of racial purity or the ideal of a single place for all women. Catherine Schultz ends her 2017 article on Murray in the New Yorker with the well-known quote from Galatians that she thinks describes Murray's lifelong claim. You probably remember it. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. These categories for human beings have lost their usefulness, if indeed they ever were fully useful. We would do well to move on. Murray saw herself whole, not divided into categorical parts. I think Murray's story affirms several Unitarian Universalist principles, but primarily the first, respect for all persons. In addition, I think her life affirms the words from our own Sunday service about the freedom to explore the vast reaches of mind and spirit. The Methodist Church hired her to write a book. The Episcopal Church made her a saint. But I think we might want to claim her as a model Unitarian Universalist. Thank you for listening to her story, and I hope that story will inspire a good discussion.